Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving deep into Philippians 2.13 today. And wow, you sent in some fascinating stuff. Analyses, study guides, even personal notes. Looks like you're ready to get serious about this passage, huh?
It's amazing how this passage, it's not just some theoretical theology.
Huh.
This is a real letter written from prison by Paul to the church in Philippi. And in these verses, he packs in so much about humility, unity, serving others, really the heart of following Christ.
That's what gets me thinking about these letters and their historical context. It's easy to forget they weren't just ideas floating around, but real people living them out in tough times. Paul's in prison, Timothy's on his way to check on the Philippians. Could you paint the picture a bit? What were they up against back then?
So the Philippian church, they were close to Paul's heart, but they had pressure from all sides. Outside, persecution for their faith, and inside, divisions and disagreements cropping up. Even locked up, Paul's worried about them, so he sends Timothy to lift their spirits and remind them what their faith is really about.
Knowing that background adds weight to Paul's words, doesn't it?
Correct.
He's not just lecturing. He's pleading with them to stand strong, to live in a way that shows Christ's love and unity. Right away in Philippians 2.1-4, he's talking about fellowship in the Spirit, tenderness and compassion, being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and purpose. But hold on a second, before we go further, can you explain that fellowship in the Spirit? We talk about experiencing it, but what does it actually mean?
That's a good question. Fellowship in the Spirit, it means that shared experience believers have because they're united by the Holy Spirit. A common bond, belonging, it goes beyond our differences and pulls us together with love and unity. Think of it like, imagine people gathered around a campfire. They're sharing stories, enjoying each other's company. There's warmth there, connection, belonging. That's what fellowship in the Spirit should feel like: comfort, encouragement, shared purpose.
I get it, like being part of something bigger, a community where you're supported and loved, even when things are rough.
Exactly. And that sense of fellowship is essential, especially when facing trials and persecution. And that's exactly what the Philippians were going through. Paul reminds them they're not alone in this fight. They have each other and the Holy Spirit to guide and strengthen them.
And he drops this bombshell. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others. Philippians 2.3-4. Easy to read and nod along, but wow, when you really stop and think about what he's saying, pretty radical concept, right?
It is, especially in Roman society, where power, status, personal gain were everything. Paul turns that upside down. He says, no, true greatness is in humility, putting others first, their needs before your own.
Whoa. Need a moment to process that one. Like rewiring your brain.
Yeah.
Makes me wonder, did Paul really expect them to live this perfectly? Was he being idealistic or was there something more to it?
I think it's both. He sets a high bar, a radical way of life that goes against the grain, for sure. But he's not naive. He gets that they're human, they'll mess up. But it's the direction, the goal. He wants them focused on Christ, imitating his example, constantly striving for that selfless love and humility.
So like aiming for a target. Maybe not hitting the bullseye every time, but you're trying to get as close as you can. He gives them this tough command, and then it's like he's saying, I know it's hard, but look, and he points them to the ultimate example, Jesus.
You got it. Philippians 2.5:11, one of the most beautiful, profound passages in Scripture. It paints this picture of Christ who, being God, didn't hold on to his divine privileges. He emptied himself, became a servant, obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross.
Mind-blowing, isn't it? Jesus, equal with God, chooses to humble himself, to become a servant, suffer, and die for us. What message do you think Paul wanted to get across by highlighting this?
I think he's saying, look, if Jesus, God himself, humbled himself to this degree, then we, who are just human, can surely learn to set aside our pride and selfishness. It's a call to radical humility, to see that true greatness isn't about power or status, it's about service and sacrifice.
Not just imitating his actions, but cultivating his mindset, that humility and selflessness. But how do we actually do that in our daily lives? Admiring Jesus is one thing, but how do we translate that into concrete actions?
That's where the rubber meets the road, right? And I think Paul tackles that head on in the next verses. He talks about working out your salvation with fear and trembling, Philippians 2.12.
That phrase always gives me chills. Sounds intense. Break it down for us. What's this working out your salvation all about?
Important to be clear, Paul isn't saying we earn salvation through hard work. Salvation's a free gift from God, received through faith in Jesus. But it comes with responsibility. Working out your salvation means actively living out our faith, letting God's grace transform us from the inside out.
So it's not about trying to be good enough for God, but about how his grace changes our thoughts, actions, relationship.
Exactly. And the fear and trembling part, it's often misunderstood. Not about being terrified of God, but having deep reverence and awe for who he is and what he's done for us, recognizing how huge his grace is and responding with humility and obedience.
Like a healthy respect that pushes us to live in a way that honors God, reflecting his love to the world.
You got it. And remember, we're not alone in this. The next verse says, "For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose." Philippians 2:13.
A partnership, then. God empowers us, but we choose to work with his grace. That's the hard part, isn't it? Talking about humility and service is one thing, but living it in our messy lives.
You're telling me. And Paul knew how hard it was, so he gives some practical advice. Do everything without grumbling or arguing. Philippians 2:14.
Oof, tough one. Especially now when it's so easy to complain and get caught up in arguments. What do you think Paul was getting at there?
Highlighting the importance of our attitude, our perspective. It's easy to be negative, complain about our situation, get stuck in disagreements. But Paul encourages a different path, to grow in gratitude and contentment, even when things are tough.
Shifting our focus then, from what we lack to what we have, what's wrong to what's right.
Exactly. And that change, it doesn't just affect us, it affects those around us too. No one wants to be around a grump all the time. But joy, gratitude, those are contagious. They draw people in, create a more positive, harmonious atmosphere.
Makes sense.
Right.
Our attitude, it either adds to the darkness or it's a light in the world. And speaking of light, Paul uses that metaphor in verse 15, calling us to shine like stars in the universe as you hold out the word of life.
One of my favorite images in this passage. Imagine a vast, dark night sky. Then suddenly, those brilliant stars twinkling in the darkness. That's how Paul wants us to be beacons of hope and truth in a world that can feel so lost and directionless.
Beautiful, but it begs the question, how do we hold out the word of life in a way that really makes a difference? Is it just sharing our faith, or is more to it?
Definitely about sharing our faith, both in words and actions. But it goes deeper. It's embodying Christ's truth and love in everything we do. Letting our light shine so bright that it lights the way for others, drawing them to the source of that light, which is Christ himself.
And that circles back to working out your salvation,
Yeah.
letting God's grace change us, right? The more we become like Christ, the more our lives will naturally reflect his light to the world.
You got it. And it's important to remember, Paul doesn't just leave us with ideals and commands. He gives real examples of people who lived this out.
You mean Timothy and Epaphroditus, right? What can we learn from them?
Well, in verses 19 to 30, we see they were both dedicated to serving Christ in the Philippian church. Timothy, my son, as Paul calls him, was known for genuinely caring for others, putting their needs first.
I love those glimpses into their character. It makes it so relatable. Like, okay, these weren't superheroes. They were real people who struggled and sacrificed, but ultimately chose to live out their faith in incredible ways.
You said it. And it reminds us we don't have to be perfect to be used by God. We all have strengths and weaknesses, flaws and limitations. What matters is our willingness to surrender to God's will, allowing him to work through us. And then there's Epaphroditus. Fascinating guy.
Oh yeah, Epaphroditus. In the notes you sent, it mentioned he went through a lot. What was his story?
So the Philippians sent Epaphroditus to help Paul while he was in prison. Long, dangerous journey. And when he gets there, he throws himself into serving Paul. He even gets so sick he almost dies. Paul's deeply moved by his dedication, his sacrifice.
Wow, risking his own life to serve Paul. That's serious commitment, putting others before himself. Hard to even wrap your head around that.
It is. Says a lot about Epaphroditus. It wasn't about fame or anything like that. It was love for Paul, a desire to serve Christ.
Makes you think, who are the Epaphroditus in our own lives? Those people working tirelessly, serving without needing the spotlight. We kind of take those folks for granted, don't we?
We do, and Paul saw that. That's why he makes a point of praising Epaphroditus, telling the Philippians to honor him for his service. Philippians 2:29, he says, "Receive him, therefore, in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such in reputation."
Good reminder to appreciate those who serve faithfully, even when nobody's watching. Unsung heroes of the faith, showing us what Christ's love really looks like. Talking about these real examples. It strikes me how Paul keeps circling back to humility, Christ's example, how we relate to each other. But it's like he's building towards something bigger, deeper. What's the link between humility and everything else we've been discussing?
You're sharp. You're right. He's weaving these ideas together, and humility is the thread. He's showing us it's not just being meek or shy. Humility, it's the bedrock of a life that reflects Christ. The key to unity, selfless service, holding out that word of life, everything he's been talking about.
How does that work, though?
Yeah.
How does humility lead to all those things? That's where I get stuck. It seems backwards, that humility equals greatness or effectiveness.
Seems counterintuitive, right? The world tells us to be successful, you got to promote yourself, seek recognition, put yourself first. But Paul, he flips the script. True greatness, he says, comes from humbling ourselves before God and before each other.
Tough concept to grasp, especially with all the self-promotion and achievement around us. Can you give a real-life example? How would this play out?
Let's say you're in a disagreement with someone. If you come in with pride, arrogance, got to prove you're right, they're wrong, well, things will probably blow up even more. But if you approach it with humility, listening to their side, admitting your own faults, seeking common ground, much more likely to find a peaceful solution.
I see that. So humility, it's not weakness, it's actually a source of strength. It can make us more effective, especially when things get tough.
Exactly. And it's not about denying your worth or putting yourself down. It's recognizing that your value, your identity, comes from Christ, not your accomplishments or your status.
Shifting the focus then, from ourselves to God and to others.
Mhm.
And maybe that frees us from the need to prove ourselves, to compete, to always be right. We can serve others with genuine love and humility, no strings attached.
You got it. And I think that's the heart of what Paul's getting at here. True joy and fulfillment, they don't come from putting ourselves on a pedestal, but from surrendering, from pouring ourselves out in service to God and others.
The more we let go of our ego, our self-centeredness, the more space there is for God's love and grace to fill us up.
Beautiful way to put it, a message that's as relevant today as it was back then. Our world's obsessed with self-promotion, achievement, personal fulfillment. But the irony is, true happiness, true purpose, those come not from chasing our own glory, but from surrendering to God's will and serving others with humility and love.
What makes this passage so challenging, yet so freeing too? It's a call to step outside ourselves, break free from ego and self-centeredness, and embrace a totally different way of life, one marked by humility, unity, serving others.
And that, I believe, is what it truly means to follow Christ.
As we've gone deeper, it's amazing how each verse builds on the last, like weaving this tapestry of ideas and principles. Humility, unity, service, examples of Jesus and his followers. But there's a pattern. Paul seems to switch between setting a high bar and then offering grace. He calls us to radical humility, but then reminds us it's God who empowers us to live it out, challenges us to shine like stars, but then points to real people with flaws and all who made a huge difference.
You're picking up on something important. I think that pattern reveals a key truth about the Christian life. It's both striving and surrendering. We're called to aim high, press towards becoming more like Christ, but knowing we'll mess up along the way. We'll need God's grace to pick us up and keep us going.
That's reassuring, actually. Takes the pressure off trying to be perfect, lets us embrace the messy reality of our journey. We're all works in progress, right? But God's all about transforming lives, and he's willing to work with us, even in our brokenness.
Absolutely. And that's what makes Paul's letters so real and inspiring. He doesn't hide his own struggles, his weaknesses. He talks about them openly because he knows that's where God's power shines through the most.
It's like that verse in 2 Corinthians, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." We don't have to have it all together to be used by God. In fact, it's often when we're broken and vulnerable that he shines through the most.
Beautiful truth. Speaks to the power of grace. It's not about earning God's favor, but receiving his love and forgiveness no matter what. Letting that love change us from the inside out.
And that change could be messy, uncomfortable, but ultimately it's a journey of hope and redemption.
You said it. And that's what makes following Christ so compelling. It's not about rules or being morally perfect. It's about encountering the living God, experiencing his grace, changing us, and becoming more and more like Christ every day.
That reminds me, a question from the study guide.
Hmm.
How does holding forth the word of life connect with working out your salvation with fear and trembling? Seem like separate ideas, but I feel like there's a link.
Great question. You're right, there is a deep connection. Holding forth the word of life, it's about sharing the gospel, but also living it out. And that's where working out your salvation comes in. Letting God's grace transform us, mold us into Christ's image so our lives reflect his truth and love.
So we can't really share Christ's message if we're not living it ourselves. Our actions, attitude, relationships, they should all point back to how the gospel has changed us.
Exactly. And that's why the fear and trembling is important. Not fearing punishment, but having deep reverence for God's holiness, knowing how human and fragile we are. We need his grace every step of the way.
Like walking a tightrope. We're trying to stay balanced, move forward in faith, but always aware we could fall. We need God's grace to keep us steady, guide our steps, help us up when we stumble.
Perfect analogy. Highlights the importance of humility. When we're humble, we acknowledge we need God, we're open to his correction, willing to lean on his strength, not just our own.
So humility is not putting ourselves down. It's recognizing we need God's grace and submitting to how he's changing us. And it's that change, that working out of our salvation, that lets us truly hold forth the word of life to the world.
Brilliant summary. You've really captured the essence of Paul's message here.
I gotta admit, this deep dive is making me rethink what it means to be a Christian. It's more than just believing the right things or going to church. It's about letting God's grace seep into every part of our lives, changing our attitudes, relationships, actions. We become living examples of his love and truth.
And that's a lifelong journey, one that needs constant surrender, letting go of our ego and self-centeredness. But it's a journey worth taking. It leads to true joy, fulfillment, a purpose that's bigger than we can grasp.
As we've been talking, I keep thinking about those quiz and essay questions you mentioned. Seemed intimidating at first, but now I get it. They're not just testing knowledge, they're forcing us to really wrestle with these truths, figure out how to apply them in our own lives.
That's the point. That's where real learning happens. It's not just about piling up information. It's about letting that information change our hearts and minds and how we live.
It's like taking a seed, planting it in our hearts, and nurturing it with prayer, reflection, action. It can grow into something beautiful and life-giving.
Beautiful analogy. Reminds us that the Christian life is all about growth and change. It's not reaching perfection overnight. It's taking those little steps of faith, day by day, letting God's grace work in us.
Being patient with ourselves then, giving ourselves the same grace we get from God.
You got it. And remembering, we're not alone in this. We have God's Spirit to guide us, his word to teach us, and each other to encourage and support us on the way.
Speaking of each other, I'm curious about what the study guide says about Timothy and Epaphroditus. What stood out to you when you compared and contrasted them?
Well, what struck me was how both were faithful servants, but in different ways. Timothy, he was more of a pastor, a teacher. He was great at explaining God's word and encouraging people.
Right. Paul even said in Philippians 2.22 that he had no one else like Timothy, someone who genuinely cared for people and put their needs first. A true shepherd, leading and guiding the flock with love and compassion.
Exactly. Then you have Epaphroditus, more of a behind-the-scenes worker, someone who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, serving in practical ways.
And we saw how he risked his own health to care for Paul in prison. He truly lived out that selfless service that Paul talks about throughout this passage.
And it's encouraging because it shows us there's no one-size-fits-all way to serve God. We have different gifts, talents, personalities.
Like we're all pieces of a puzzle. Each one's unique, important for completing the picture. And when we come together, each using our gifts to serve God and others, it's something beautiful and powerful.
Perfect way to put it. Highlights the importance of unity. Paul keeps urging the Philippians to be like-minded, have the same love, be one in spirit and purpose.
Right. In Philippians 2.2, he says, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being full accord and of one mind.
Yeah.
He's not just talking about agreeing on every little theological detail. It's a deeper unity, a unity of heart and purpose that goes beyond our differences.
Exactly. And Timothy and Epaphroditus show us that this unity is possible, even among people with different gifts and personalities. They were both focused on the same mission, the same goal to spread the gospel and build up the church. That shared commitment united them, despite their differences.
Like they understood that the mission was bigger than their own personal preferences or agendas. They were willing to put their egos aside and work together for the greater good.
And that's a challenge for all of us, isn't it? Letting go of the need to be right, to be in control, to have things our way, embracing the beauty of unity and diversity.
Recognizing that we're all part of the same body, the body of Christ, and each part is important for the health and well-being of the whole.
Powerful image. It reminds us that we need each other. We can't do this Christian life alone. We need the support, encouragement, and accountability of others. We need to learn from each other, challenge each other, and push each other towards love and good deeds.
Like we're all climbing the same mountain, but we don't have to do it alone. We can help each other along the way, offer a hand up when someone stumbles, and celebrate together when we reach the summit.
Beautiful analogy. And it highlights the importance of community. We're not meant to be isolated. We're created for connection, relationship, belonging.
And that sense of belonging, that fellowship in the Spirit we talked about earlier, it's so important for our growth and well-being as believers.
You're absolutely right. And it's something that's often missing in our modern world, where everyone's so focused on themselves. We're so busy chasing our own goals, our own success, that we forget about the importance of community and connection. But that's a mistake. It's in community that we truly learn what it means to love and be loved, to serve and be served, to grow and mature in our faith.
It's like we're all threads in a tapestry. Each one adds color and texture to the overall design. But it's only when we're woven together that we create something truly beautiful and lasting.
Wonderful image. Reminds us that our lives are interconnected. We impact each other in ways we may never fully understand.
And that brings us back to how we hold forth the word of life in a way that makes a difference. It's not just about words. It's about living it out in community, in our relationships with others, in a way that reflects Christ's love and grace.
Exactly. And Timothy and Epaphroditus show us how to do that. They weren't perfect, but they were committed to serving Christ and his church, and their lives made a real difference. They showed us the power of humility, unity, and selfless service.
And those are the very qualities that Paul is calling us to cultivate in our own lives.
And it's a call worth listening to because it leads to a life of joy, purpose, and eternal significance.
As we wrap up this deep dive into Philippians 2, I'm realizing it's so much more than just a to-do list for good Christians.
Absolutely. It's about the heart of what it means to have a life centered on Christ. Paul, he weaves together all these different ideas into one big picture.
Yeah, it's not just about like being humble or serving others. It's the why behind it all. It's about getting that mind of Christ, letting his humility and selflessness just soak into every part of who we are.
It's like Paul saying, look at Jesus, how he emptied himself, humbled himself all the way to death. That's the kind of radical change that happens when we let God's grace in.
And that change, that new way of seeing things, that's what gives us the power to actually live out those instructions. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. It's not about gritting our teeth and trying to be good enough. It's about God working in us, changing us from the inside out.
That's where working out your salvation with fear and trembling comes in, right? Not earning it, but being part of the process, becoming more like Christ.
So it's like we're both the masterpiece and the canvas.
Yeah.
God's the artist. He's working on us, shaping us. But we got to be willing to let him do his thing, let go of how we think we should be.
You got it. And that surrender, letting go of ego and self-centeredness, that's what opens us up to the power of God's grace. It lets us really grasp Christ's mind and live out his example in our lives.
This whole idea of having the mind of Christ, it really sticks with me. It's not just copying what he did, but understanding his heart, his motivation, what drove him.
What was that driving force?
Love, right? Pure, selfless love,
Yeah.
willing to sacrifice everything for others. Love that isn't about what it can get, but what it can give.
That's the love Paul's calling us to. Love grounded in humility, looking out for others before ourselves. Love that serves even when it's hard or costs us something.
The source material had this glossary of key terms. I was struck by how words like humility, service, love, they're so much deeper than we usually think about.
It's like we need to reclaim those words, rediscover what they really mean, let them sink in.
Like humility. The definition wasn't thinking less of ourselves, but thinking of ourselves less often. Shifting focus from our own wants and truly considering what others need, what their perspective is.
And service wasn't just doing good deeds, but a heart posture. Being willing to put others first, help them out, without expecting anything back.
And love wasn't just a feeling, but a choice we make, an action, a commitment to what's best for the other person, even when it's tough.
Those definitions, they push us beyond surface level stuff. To really dig into what it means to follow Jesus, it's not about checking off boxes or rules. It's letting those qualities become part of who we are.
Becoming love in action, humility walking around, service as a way of life.
And that takes a lifetime, not a one-time decision, but surrendering every day, constantly letting God's grace work on us.
Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Comes back to that. It's a journey. It needs both effort and humility. We got to seek God's guidance, let his word and spirit shape us, but also admit we need him, that we can't do anything without him.
And that realization that we depend on God, that's where gratitude comes from. That's what makes us want to shine like stars in the universe as you hold out the word of life.
I love that imagery. It's so full of hope. Even in darkness, our lives matter. We can be lights, pointing others to the source of all light and life.
And it doesn't have to be big, showy stuff. It's being faithful in the little things, everyday moments, those small acts of kindness and service.
Being a reflection of Christ's love at home, work, in our communities, let our light shine so bright others can't help but see it.
You know, it's amazing. That light we're supposed to shine, it's not even ours. It's Christ's light shining through us.
It's like we're containers holding this incredible treasure. And the more we empty ourselves of ego, self-centeredness, the brighter that light gets.
Beautiful. Reminds us that our lives aren't about us. It's about Him, reflecting His glory, showing His love to the world.
So, as we finish this deep dive into Philippians 2, let's not just leave it here. Let's take it with us. Let's challenge ourselves to get that mind of Christ, grow in humility and selflessness, serve others with love and grace. And remember, we're not alone in this. We have God's Spirit, His Word, and each other.
Well said. May our lives reflect His love, be beacons of hope in a world that desperately needs it. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
See you next time.